So that brings us to number 4. So if number 5 is the most controversial, number 4 is in a lot of ways the most duh kind of thing. But I do feel it's noteworthy. The San Antonio Spurs are the most underrated franchise in NBA history. I feel like they're the Honda Civic of NBA franchises. They're durable, they're nice, they're good for 20 years. You don't really want to be seen with it. You're okay if your kid's a part of it, you feel comfortable, but you hope your car never breaks down and you got to catch a ride. Greg Popovich is top 5 coaches in NBA history. I don't think that's necessarily arguable. I don't know where I fit him in there. I think that obviously Jackson and Auerbach are 1A, 1B, depending on how you want to do it. I probably put Auerbach number 1 because he also played GM, and I do think that that's an underrated ability, which also caters to what I'm talking about with Popovich. Obviously, Jackson made a lot of the choices that dictated his teams, but he was also a bit of a mercenary. And so, though I think that nobody could have done what he did with a lot of those teams not named in the top 5 that I'm talking about, he also put himself in perfect position. He knew what he was doing. He made sure he had the talent to make himself look good. And that's not a knock on Phil Jackson by any measure. I don't mean that way, but I think that it's at least worth noting. I mean, Pat Riley, great coach. I think I take Popovich over Riley, to be honest. Riley did a great job of dictating tempo and pace, but he left the floor for a reason and then poached a team from Stan Van Gundy once it was a championship caliber team. Whereas Greg Popovich is kind of like, just as I was talking about Thibodeau, roll the ball out, I'm going to beat you up, let's see who's better. That guy's mean, he's nasty, he's former military, and it bleeds through him. And his team is completely colored in what he does. Okay, so let's just talk about statistical stuff with the Spurs first before we get into it. And I know a lot of people are going to go, duh, we already feel that way. But let me ask you, let's say that we're talking about a 16-year stretch. And I asked you to give me, let's narrow it down. 16 years is a bit broad. It's a little vague. It makes it a little tougher because they've been good for so long. And that's tough to do to a lot of franchises. Let's narrow it down to a 10-year stretch. And I ask you who you feel is the best teams over a 10-year span. I feel pretty confident that the Lakers of the 70s, the Celtics of 2 different generations, the Celtics of the 80s, the Celtics of the 60s, 70s, the Lakers of the 80s, and the Bulls of the 90s are going to be on most people's list before the Spurs. I don't think that's unfair. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think that a big part of that as well is that those teams had players that were not necessarily better, but were far more prominent. I mean, when it's all said and done, who knows when it's said and done with the way the Spurs teams play, they may only end up with 3 guys that were Hall of Famers. And David Robinson isn't even really an integral part of this particular run. By the time that this team got going in 97, 98, Robinson was still really a good player. I mean, he was a dominant player. And kudos to the Spurs for having 2 guys in the post that have been in the top 25, 30 all time. So they've gone 30 years with a dominant post presence. That's pretty absurd. A 30-year stretch. I mean, even the Lakers had a breakup for a couple years. These guys just kept going. But Robinson, Duncan, and Parker are the only Hall of Famers. Ginobili's a nice player. He's kind of underrated for what he's been able to do, but part of that's because he's never been able to stay healthy. I think that if Ginobili was a consistently healthy player, he probably would be in the discussion for the Hall of Fame as well, because he's had so many big moments. I don't know that there's a tertiary player that's had more big moments not named Robert Horry or Derek Fisher, and those guys aren't nearly as prominent. Ginobili's taking kind of a back seat to the guys that have been around for quite some time, you know. But the thing that's amazing with the Spurs is just their consistency. 15 out of the 16 years from 1997 to 2013, they've won 50-plus games. And the only year they didn't was a strike-shortened season with which they won the title. That was their first championship season. That is absurd. Teams don't do that. That's not normal. Usually you have to reload at some point. They average, over that stretch, 55.5 wins. And if you take out the strike-shortened season, 56.7. That's monumental. If I told you right now that your team could go out and win 56 games, you'd be jumping up and down for joy in most cases, if you're not Miami, basically. I mean, that's a given with them. But everybody else, you're happy. And this is what the Spurs do. They're just steady Eddie. They just keep going. And I hate the Spurs. It pains me to say what I'm saying right now. I lived in San Antonio. I was a Suns fan with McDyess and Finley and had to watch Duncan do what he did. My dad was an assistant coach on the St. Mary's team that played Wake Forest in Duncan's senior year. They had a guy by the name of Brad Millard. Really just called him Big Continent. It was completely appropriate. He got listed at whatever he was, but he was about 7'3", 360, and 360 may be me being kind. It's kind of like Oprah listing herself at 140. Brad had a great game. It was a breakout game for him against Duncan. People loved it. He had 2 nice drop step dunks. All of a sudden, they're talking about him in the lottery. Duncan had a nice, quiet 22 and 22, because that's what he does. And he was perfect to just put him as a cog in that Spurs machine. And then Greg Popovich is that coach. He doesn't get worked up unless he's being interviewed on the sidelines. He knows what he's doing. If I have to win one game, I'm not sure that there's a coach going right now that I take ahead of him. In fact, no, that's a lie. I'm absolutely positive there's not a coach going that I take ahead of him. Krzyzewski tends to wilt in the big games a lot of times, and I think he and Popovich are the 2 best coaches out there. I think that there's some other guys that I think are, you know, I love Thibodeau, but I don't think that Thibodeau exactly can do what Popovich does from I can win with whatever you give me. I think Thibodeau can do that, but there's just something about Popovich. He's so intense and so fierce, but also pragmatically, he's so good. You watch what they do in games. That team never stresses. That team never, ever, ever looks out of their element. Now, they have times where they make mental lapses, but even that's really, really rare. Really, really rare. What he does, look, I wouldn't want him as a father-in-law. I think he might punch me in the face. But if I had to go to war, I want that guy in my foxhole. He's led the Spurs to 14 straight seasons of 50-plus wins. 14 straight. If that strike season doesn't happen, it's 16 straight, because that team, if you extrapolate it from a statistical standpoint, would have won on damn near 60 games. That's absurd. And he's done it with only 3 guys that are Hall of Famers. Only 3 guys. The team that's second ever is the Lakers at 12. I don't know that there's been a Lakers team at any point that's had less than 3 guys that are Hall of Famers over a 10-year stretch. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. He keeps winning. And the thing that's even funnier is when you look at them and some of the stuff that they've done in the postseason. So he's got 4 titles over that 16-year stretch. They lost to the Western Conference Finals to the Lakers in 2001 when Derek Fisher makes a shot that's not even possible in the time that happens. And in 2006, they lose to a Mavericks team where they're up by 3, and Ginobili makes a horrible, horrible play and fouls Nowitzki. And he ends up with the 3-point play and the Mavericks win in overtime. Now, granted, maybe they don't win that title, but all I'm saying is like every single year you can pencil them for at least the second round of the playoffs, if not further. Every single year you know they're going to win 50 games. It must be really, really, really easy to be the Spurs owner. How's your season going to go? We're going to win 50 games. We're going to make the playoffs. There's a pretty good chance we're going to end up in the finals. We're probably going to have a guy that's going to be in the Hall of Fame at the pivot position. Like, he doesn't have to show up. Greg Popovich can do it all. And what makes it more incredible is what they do as far as a player standpoint. They are the best run team in the NBA. They draft better than anybody I've ever seen on a consistent basis. They are the best run team in sports right now. Sports, not just basketball, sports. And what they have been consistently do in the draft is absolutely absurd. And I know that they're always patted on the back for this. I know that this is not anything new. But Tony Parker, second team All-NBA point guard, MVP of the NBA Finals, was taken 28th in 2001. 28th. There's not 27 guys in the NBA right now that are probably better than him, let alone in that single draft. Manu Ginobili was taken in the second round. He was the 57th pick.